have 3 kids, 9 grandkids, and who knows what's on the way.
Good morning. I'm Karen Pennington. I'm serving on the Board of Trustees, and I'm happy to be doing that. I'm glad to be back involved in church work again. The interesting fact that I was going to share, at the last time somebody said they were born in Beckley, West Virginia. That's me. I was also born in Beckley, West Virginia.
Mark Quickle, I'm a deacon. I am also a West Virginia born, Wardensville, so a little small town that just happens to be in West Virginia. But I'm actually a Georgia transplant to here, so I know I've gotten a few comments from Sam about how brave I might be.
I'm Allison Meredith. I'm an elder, and I thought I'd share a quick funny story about when we lived in Massachusetts. My husband was getting his Master of Divinity, and I was getting my PhD. You've heard that before, right? Putting honey through. So I was working full-time as a high school math teacher, and when I got interviewed by these teenagers to just be an article, and then they're little teenager, the next day I got pounded with questions. Miss Meredith, they said in the article the Bible was your favorite book. They're kidding, right? What, do you read it every day or something? I mean, I'm not kidding, like the entire day. And so it was just because I grew up in Kingsport. So it was a good reminder to me. I grew up in the Bible Belt. I don't live in the Bible Belt anymore. So for 5 years, that was good. But we were glad to move back here, too. So lots of good stories.
Good morning. I'm Rush Powers. I'm an elder. And I went to school in Middle Georgia, in Macon, Georgia. And sophomore year, 2 friends of mine and I drove down to Plains, Georgia. The night Jimmy Carter was elected, we got
Hi, I'm Mary Alice Rice, and I'm a deacon, and one interesting factoid about my life. I came in just a minute ago, so I haven't had time to think about an interesting factoid about my life. A boring one, then. Well, I don't know if this is boring or not, but my plans for the rest of the day include having a doggy birthday party at my house. My dog and one of my friend's dogs both have birthdays in February, and this will be the 4th or 5th year in a row that we have had a joint dog birthday party. So that's my interesting factoid.
I'm Dave. You all know me. That's the interesting factoid. Okay, I shared last time that I had dinner twice with Alan Shepard.
And I'm Sam, and I'm a pastor here. And the interesting factoid about my life is today you all get to be guinea pigs because I had to sort of put all this curriculum together because the denomination gave us 0 resources to carry out their mandate. All right, yeah. So if it's good, it's bad. I did the best that I could given 0 resources. All right, let's see. Next. All right, now we're not going to do the 2 partners. What we're going to do is try to break up, we're going to take 5 minutes, break up into groups of like 3 or 4, and feel free to pick your belongings up because we're going to have little breakout discussion groups. Break up into groups of 3 or 4. Take a few minutes, get to know each other, just talk, get comfortable with each other. If you need to circle your chairs so you feel like a connected group, that would be great. And if you need an extra bit of coffee to get ready to go this morning, that would be the time. Give you 5 minutes to do that work, and then we're going to kick off into the curriculum proper, okay? So break, go for it. take about one more minute, and then we're going to get into material. All right. Wonderful conversations, and I'm really happy for that, and we'll have lots of opportunity for conversation this afternoon. I do want to just give you all a few reminders, some of you all who couldn't be here for the first training, that all of the resources, the basic resources that you need, Book of Order Confessions, Robert's Rules, as well as the Robert's Rules cheat sheet can be found online. The links are in your packet. So just please keep that in mind. No need to buy a book unless you want to have a paper copy. So just want to make sure you have that. We're going to start off today talking about the new Manual of Operations. Now, a quick thing, you'll notice there is a link that we sent out, and we'll continue to send out. This is an open revisions document. You'll see here actually in the paper copy, and if he doesn't mind me pointing out, Aaron did a great job, and that's the stuff on the side, going through, marking it up. And then I went in and made those changes. You can do exactly the same thing online, and we invite you to do that. It's gone through a number of revisions. We've been working on this for 2 years and finally getting it to this point, and there's still work that needs to be done. So this is a living, breathing document that we will continue to revise and review periodically. And I want to kind of explain to you the philosophy and the work over 2 years that went into this new manual. And it is important for us to get that down, because if you get these guiding principles and these key concepts, I think that you will have great success in your work as either an elder or a deacon or a trustee. So one of the really key concepts that I outlined for the session and the officers early on is that I felt, and I think there was agreement, that one thing that we would like to do as a church is break the mold of generational silos that exist in church. There are young people, people with kids, older people, and it seems like there's not a whole lot of interaction that takes place. Even sometimes the divides that can exist between contemporary and traditional worship can follow these generational lines. They don't have to. But we wanted to be really intentional, and we've been making some ground on this to try and at least have a number of events each year that are multi-generational, and if it's possible, to incorporate that. So one example of this was a couple of years ago, we made the change on the Orlando trip to make that a multi-generational trip, and the age range went all the way from 4 up into their 90s, and it was very successful. There were new challenges that presented themselves because we were incorporating that larger age group, but there were interesting interactions that happened because of it. On Sunday night, we're going to have the chili cook-off, and that's another example of the whole church getting together, regardless of age, enjoying being around each other, because one weakness that I've personally seen in churches is that as churches and church culture splits along worship preferences and things of this nature, it's very interesting. A lot of large, what we might call mega churches, you're not going to see a whole lot of people over the age of 55 there. You're going to see, this is a lot of younger people, maybe people with kids. They've got lots of programs for the kids. It's hip. It's the be at church. Well, where's the witness of the older generation that can share some of that wisdom, that hard-earned wisdom that life teaches us? And so one thing we wanted to do is to try to break the mold and at least try to be more multi-generational. The other was we wanted to focus on discipling. That one of the key things that we need to do is to equip each other, whether we're teaching or learning or in both roles, is we want to disciple each other. We want to build each other up and equip each other with what's necessary to share the witness to the lordship of Jesus Christ. And so you'll see, if you look at the DSF overhaul that took place, which is fantastic, it's going well. They're following these multi-generational concepts, trying to do that, and a real emphasis on discipling at all different areas of life. The other one is missional. We wanted to be a missional church. And what we mean by that is we come, we gather, we worship God, we disciple each other, we enjoy each other's company regardless of age, and all of this not just for our own sake, not just so that we come and we feel good and we've done our religious duty for the week, but that we're equipped and prepared then to be sent out into the world in whatever context we're called into to share that witness. It can be in your workplace, it can be in your community groups, it can be all the stuff you see on the mission wall. We want that to be one of the key markers of First Presbyterian Church of Bristol, is that we're known for really equipping, sending out, and walking alongside people that assist and aid, not just in the proclamation of the gospel, but also in just helping people who are having a hard time. We want to really be there for folks. And then the last thing, or one of the fourth thing, is that we wanted to focus on relationship. Everything that we say and do, and one of the changes that you have seen or will see is that we do, when it even comes to the officers of the church, when we have our monthly meetings, we start with a joint meeting of deacons, elders, and trustees. Rather than having silos of each of these three groups do their own thing, we bring them together. We do stuff like have breakout groups where you can get to know each other, and we really try to develop those relationships. We even have the elder deacon buddy system where we ask you to find a buddy, commit to, at least calling, texting, maybe having coffee or something once a month and praying for each other, because we want people to get to know each other in a way that they didn't know each other before. And the same goes with all of the events, all the programs we do, is we really want to develop those strong bonds of relationship. And then finally, here is the purpose of all these things is that they point to Jesus Christ. In the fact that we get together all age groups, right? We are walking along each other, aside each other, and we're helping each other along the way as we make our way back home. Discipling, the same thing. We're equipping each other so that we're pointing each other to Jesus and that we can point others to Jesus. And it goes on through the list. One of the symbols that I kind of used to summarize this was a compass. And if our compass, the way we're going to do church, it would look something like this. Our North Star is always Jesus Christ, relationship with Jesus Christ, emphasizing Him, glorifying Him. But the East and the West and the South, as you see, the intergenerational, multi-generational, missional, discipleship, those are those pointers. And the entire thing is surrounded by this concept of relationship with Jesus, relationship with each other. This was one of the key things we were trying to incorporate into the change. So I think that you see this in our new mission statement that you can find in the manual. We did series on this last semester on the mission statement, and it's as a community being made whole by God, we love, serve, and grow through Jesus. And so I think you can see each of the elements of these major markers present in the mission statement. And I think you can also see this in the vision statements as well. And so what we decided was that, you know, in a typical Presbyterian fashion, we have committees for committees for committees and that will, you know, manage everything down to the committees for napkin holders. I mean, it's just, it can get really out there. And again, there is that emphasis, and we want to do that, is to do things decently in order. But after a while, something eventually suffers, like the relational piece of it, right? It can break into what I call those silos, right? You know, one area, we just do mission, that's all we want to think about. And that's problematic, because at the end of the day, if we're all called to point each other to Jesus Christ and disciple each other, then that's going to have some bearing on how we do mission in the world. And so the emphasis in the vision statements, they were to be, how are we going to live out this mission? What are the practical steps we're going to do to try to live into this new understanding of ourselves? And so you can see this section 2, pages 1 through 2. The first one there is create a welcoming environment and facilitate a community of belonging. This is the community fellowship team, and they're primarily tasked with helping us as a church community, not just to put events on, but to help recruit teams to do these things. You know, if we've got a big event like the chili cook-off, then we would want to go to the community fellowship team and say, you know, we've got this big calendar event we do each year where we're hoping that we're enjoying each other's company in a multi-generational sense. You know, we're pointing to Jesus in our fellowship, we're sharing table, and what have you. So can you help us find, you know, a group of volunteers and help facilitate that event, help us communicate that event? And so everything from ushers that you see every Sunday morning up to some of these other events, we want that group primarily to help us do that work. The second is create a network for outreach to our congregation members to share the love of Jesus, serve their needs, and grow together as a community. This is the congregational care. Now, traditionally, we used to have, and we no longer have, and we'll talk about this in a minute, we no longer have a board of deacons. One of the things that I found when I first started at this church is that we had a board of deacons, and when the board would be called, like 4 out of 15 deacons would show up. And I understand why, because nobody wants to come to a meeting just for the sake of a meeting, right? It's like, all right, what did the deacons do? Well, what do you want us to do? You know, it was this chicken and egg problem. And so one of the traditional roles of deacons is what we would call congregational care. It's acts of nurture and love and care. And so instead of having a board, as many of you deacons know, or all you deacons know, you've been assigned to particular areas. And that particular function of deacons has now been made its own team, its own committee, its own work group. And that is the congregational care group to help us care for the congregation, to work with Dave and myself and other members of the staff, to really come alongside folks and minister to them, especially in their time of needs. So everything from meal trains to hospital visitations, communion, card writing, the list goes on. We really want people, wherever they find themselves in life, to know that they are loved, they are a member of this community, and we want to be there for them. Let's see, the next one is cultivate a welcoming and sustainable worship atmosphere that equips the gathered church to grow as disciples of Jesus Christ. This is the worship committee. And so we gather and we try to cultivate that welcoming worship atmosphere. And again, you'll see the keywords welcoming environment and community fellowship and cultivate a welcoming worship atmosphere. Well, there's overlap here. And so one way that we see that overlap, because we're trying to break the silos, is that the ushers who get organized back in community fellowship team. Candy Phelps and Nancy Allerton are also members of the worship committee, and they report to us what the plans are, make sure that we have the folks that we need to do just that first thing. And I mean, if you think about it, how important is it that, imagine you're a first-time visitor to this church, right? And churches can be, they don't have to be, but can be upon your first visit, cold. Nobody knows you. Nobody knows if it's okay to say hi to you, which is odd. But anyway, we want to make sure that the first memory that they have of us is someone that says hello, wants to get to know their name. We've got the welcome station bags, things of this nature. We want people to feel like we're happy that they've come. And that's just one element of what goes in to worship. Get to the next vision statements. All right, this one, help the church to give sacrificially to build relationships locally and globally in communities where Christ calls us to meet the needs of others, serve humbly, and proclaim the serving love of Christ. This belongs to the Mission and Outreach Committee. All right, and so, I think I want you to see the keyword relationships. We don't, I think sometimes in churches it can be very easy to write checks to address problems, right? We want to help the underserved in another country or something like this. And you can get into that mode of just writing checks. Well, that's great. But what's the thing that's missing? It's the relationships. It's knowing the people that you're working with, inviting them to be part of your community, wanting to hear from them, getting regular updates. The goal of Mission and Outreach isn't just to find mission projects for us to do, but it is to report to each other regularly and to communicate with the congregation. How is that relationship going? And so one thing I think that's unique about this church is that we regularly have our mission partners that will come in, visit. Sometimes they'll preach for us. We have some partners from Brazil that I think that will be coming later in the year. Also from the partners for Paraguay, they'll be coming. And when it was last year, Juan came last year. They'll come, they'll speak, they'll stay in people's homes. We will, stay in regular contact with them. We want to really be an intimate partnership with the folks we work with. One person that you'll see if you come to the 9 a.m. who comes pretty regularly, Stephen Davis. He runs Gray House. His wife runs Harmony and Hope House. He'll bring him, his wife, and his family. He'll also bring the men from the Gray House sometimes. And yeah, there are a number of churches that they're involved with in the area. But I really like the fact that one of our mission partners locally actually comes to worship with us. Well, that's because we maintain that relationship, maintain lanes of communication open, and try to continue to cultivate and strengthen that relationship. So it's not just about the doing, it's about the relationship portion. And then this one is equip and encourage members of the congregation of every age to follow Jesus Christ and grow in spiritual maturity. This belongs to discipleship and spiritual formation, which I think has just undergone a tremendous overhaul. When I first came to this church, we did not have a functioning Christian education committee. And I was like, all right, that's interesting. Let's work on that. It took me a little while. We got the CE at that time committee going, just trying to get communication about what was going on in the different educational ministries of the church. And now we've gotten to the place where that has grown, and we've got a bunch of different teams, yes, addressing children's ministry, youth ministry, but also women's ministry, men's ministry. We're trying to build out what relational college ministry will look like. And again, I'm really impressed with the advances we've made in this committee. And then finally, coordinate the resources of the church to empower the work of the gospel. This is the Administration and Operations, or A&O committee. And this used to be 3 or 4 separate committees. It's a super committee now. But it used to be HR, buildings and ground, finance, stewardship. We even have nominations. A lot of the stuff that goes on behind the scenes that it's very easy to just sort of take for granted that it happens, but somebody's got to change the light bulbs. Somebody's got to make sure that we're, being accountable with the money that has been given. And so what we did is we rolled, and that was one that was really siloed. Imagine a situation where you want to talk about HR issues, but if it involves finance, it used to be if there was an HR issue that involved some sort of pay increase, it would have to go to HR, and then it would have to go to finance, and then maybe back to HR, and then on to, it would just bounce around all over the place. Now, in one meeting, and it takes about an hour and a half a month, this week we went an hour and 40 minutes, unfortunately, 10 minutes over, but we had a lot to talk about. We're able to talk about these issues not in a siloed way, but we're able to address all of these issues as they come up in a multivalent way. We can take up the finance issue if there's something going on with HR, or if Buildings and Grounds has a major outlay coming up, we can talk about the financial implications and get that communicated to staff and others. And so far, I think it's been pretty successful. So this is the way that we want to live out the mission of the church, the 6 practical ways. And again, these make up the committees. And everybody here is and should be involved at least with one of these groups. Now, when it comes to session and elders, we talked about this a little bit last time. One of the weaknesses that I've seen in the Presbyterian system, and it's not just like this church, it's every Presbyterian church I've ever worked in. I worked in a Presbyterian megachurch. There's about 12,000 members in Seoul, South Korea. They had a session of, I think it was like 20 or 25. It was a big session. Is that over time, as churches took on this organizational structure that resembled very much a business corporation model, what happened is that people called to the role of elder increasingly saw their job as being sort of the governing board of the church. And it was all about making the decisions about finances and things of that nature, sort of like, a member of the board. That's the way that they saw it. Not that elders didn't pray for others, but the idea of you're involved with and you're responsible for the spiritual nurture of the people really began to take more and more of a back seat. And I think that has more to do with corporate America or just corporate culture in general than it does the Bible. The Bible is very clear that the role of elder is, yes, they make important decisions, but there's discernment involved, there's prayer, there's walking alongside of people. It used to be many years ago, back in the 1800s in this church, even into the early 1900s, that the elders of this church and many other Presbyterian churches were assigned clusters of families. And once a quarter, the elders would go out and meet with every family and sort of, it sounds like a pop quiz almost, but would examine the families, like, how's your spiritual life? How can we pray for you? I don't know if I quite want to go that direction either, because it was up to the session member to determine whether or not that family or that person, could come to the Lord's table. And I don't know if we want to go there. But again, it doesn't have to be an either or. We can do both these things. And so what I want to point out is that when it comes to the session and it comes to the role of elder, it is not just a governing board. If we get into that mode, we are really missing out on one of the key areas of what it means to be an elder. Yes, some of that is outlined in the book of the order, but it is a call to both governance and nurture, both. If we're not doing both, then there's a deficiency that we need to correct. And again, some of this work that we've done has been an attempt to do that. And I just want to emphasize that for elders. And that, again, maybe you're an elder and you're not necessarily a people person, right? I get that. That doesn't mean that you can't pray for people, right? In your relationship with God, we get a prayer list. You hear about things that come up in the congregation. You're called to pray. You're called to care for the community. And so it is a both situation. Now, when it comes to trustees, trustees, this has been a big change. It used to be, especially in the Southern Church, Southern Presbyterian Church before reunion, being a trustee was really just like an honorary thing, like I'm a trustee, and occasionally you would sign checks, right? Like you would meet once a year, sign some checks, and usually big checks, and you got to, I'm a trustee. And I don't think that that's, yes, the role of the trustees to help us navigate civil authority, to make sure that we're complying with the law. Absolutely. We want your wise counsel before we enter into a contract. Have we done our due diligence? Do we have those pieces in place? But the other thing is that you can't just be responsible for making sure that we're governing the relationship with civil authorities without having an active idea or a vision of what's actually going on in the ministry of the church. One of the most destructive stories I've ever heard of a board of trustees is a church, I won't tell you what, but up in New Jersey. It still had the documentation. It was a land grant from King George, right? I mean, this church goes way back. They had this enshrined, and they had an endowment that over hundreds of years that was probably worth $40 or $50 million. I mean, it was just, and it was, in some ways, it was, instead of calling it the whatever church, it should have been like, the Historical Preservation Society. It was just all about keeping things like they were from a couple of hundred years ago. And if you came to that church, that's your identity. We're the church that's been here longer than anybody else. And if you don't like it, you can leave. I mean, it was sort of like this. Well, this board of trustees, they saw their role really as sort of the Historical Preservation Society. But they had no real, not that they didn't attend church, but they didn't have a good picture of what was going on, the dreams, the hopes, the planning for the long-term mission of the church. And it didn't take long when a new pastor came in who wanted, the neighborhood had changed. It was no longer this suburban enclave somewhere. It had grown, and there were all sorts of different people that were living in the area. They couldn't continue to double down on this history that was hundreds and hundreds of years old. They needed to go in a new direction. And guess what? In order to do that, they needed to tap some of that $40 or $50 million to do it, right? To maybe update or expand some of the facilities. My gosh, maybe we ought to think about a contemporary service that might attract people. Well, the trustees wanted nothing to do with this process. And what ensued, and I had a friend, a colleague of mine who used to teach polity at Princeton, which is church governance. And he actually, before he died, he began writing a book about the relationship in this church. It was a 10-year battle in which the trustees actually ended up going to court against their own session in church, because one had this historic preservation model in mind. The church wanted to go in the other direction. And again, very destructive, not nice. And eventually there was a brokered peace treaty, but not after they had spent a great deal of money in the courts to do this. And they slowly opened up a little bit of the spigot. But anyway, all of that to say, when it comes to trustees, we want trustees to have at least an idea of what's going on. And so they are invited to all of our joint meetings. We want to hear the ferment of our conversations about what we're doing. And they're also involved in A&O committee. We have a trustee representative for the MEF advisory committee. Actually, all three of the trustees are on MEF advisory. And so we want them to not just help us navigate civil authority. We want them to help us navigate civil authority with an eye towards the mission and the direction of the church. And so incorporating them increasingly. And here Karen was probably a little surprised on Sunday. I asked her a question along with session and elders, and I had to make it up on the spot, right? Because it's not in our ordination service. But the question is will you help us navigate that authority, but in a way that actually equips the church. And that's what we're asking trustees to do. And I think it's really important to have them in the conversation. And then finally, deacons. Again, primarily you care. You are under the authority of the session. We get that authority is normally exercised just in terms of oversight by you serving on particular committees. We'll get notes about what you're doing, want to have a general sense of what you're being called to do. But again, that key is that in the new manual, we no longer organize the deacons as a board. We don't want you to have a meeting just for the sake of a meeting. We would rather you spend your time, and again, we all have limited time, investing in the committee to which you've been called. We want you to really pour out your time and your talents, serving in a way that you feel not only empowers the church, but energizes you. We don't want you to be an officer of this church and you come to think of it as a drudgery. We want you to be actively involved. And so you are elected to specific service through Key Ministries. And again, we want to connect the skill set and your passion with what you're doing. Again, just a notice for everyone that the elders meet jointly with deacons and trustees 7 p.m. every fourth Monday of the month, unless we have to make a change. Usually it's around a holiday or something if we've got to make a change. And this hour that we'll spend together is we want to pray together. We want to study the Bible together. We want to map out a course of future. We want to hear if there's an issue going on that we maybe need to bring our collective heads together to figure out. Maybe a committee is struggling with how to do something and they need some insight or some help from another committee. Again, the point of it's to break the silo, right? M&O might need to come alongside community fellowship team to do a community outreach that's also mission oriented as well. This hour is supposed to be spent helping us break those silos and bring that together. And again, so to cultivate understanding, cooperation, spiritual growth, and communicate the needs. And then after that, the elders then meet at 8 and take up regular business. And Lord willing, unless it's a long meeting, we'll be done in an hour. But no promises. So, again, just key takeaways, and I am very cognizant of your need for the bathroom break. We're getting there. So key takeaways from the new Manual of Operations is that all the committees and deacons and stuff like that, yeah, you report to session, but we really want you to exercise greater autonomy. Now, my leadership style, it was not like this in COVID. I'll be very honest with you. During COVID, and this was not good for me, things became very command and control here because we were all trying to survive. And, it was hard to make day-to-day decisions. And so for 3 years, yes, it was very command and control, me, but that's not naturally how I like to do things, because what I do is then internalize all that pressure of needing to make all those decisions, and it drives me crazy. Instead, what I really do believe, and if you attend these joint meetings and if you've attended committee meetings, I really don't like to make the final decision on anything, because I hate it when people tell me this, I am not the CEO of the church. Please, if you've said that or thought that, and it's okay, I'm just expressing my own personal inner disposition. This is not a corporation we're not IBM. I had a choice earlier in life. I went to law school for a while. I hated it. If I wanted to be the CEO of something, I would have stayed there and done that and followed that path. I chose this path because I was called, but also because, again, I don't like that role. This is Jesus' church. You attend it, and you're a member of this community, and with the leadership of the Holy Spirit, you have to make this the church that helps bring you and the community alive. And that cannot come out of Pastor Sam's head. It just can't. And so I really do want to encourage people in your committee work to take greater autonomy in this and go the direction that you feel God is leading you. I may not agree with it, but that's okay. I'm not always right. In fact, I'm rarely right. Seriously, so please live into the larger scope of leadership here, because quite honestly, when it comes to finance, I'll give you A&O. I worked with A&O. I'm looking over here. Are you like a vice president or a president? What are you at the bank? I'm sorry. Credit officer. He's the guy who tells you if you're getting a loan or not, right? Is that, yeah. Look, think about finances in A&O. Aaron Brooks will know 1,000,000 times more than I will ever know about finances and loans and balance sheets and investment opportunities and all this. Ron's the same way. He does investments. You'll know more about that than I could ever even hope to know, or quite honestly, just because that's not my disposition, more than I'll ever really want to know about that. I can read a spreadsheet, but I'm not an expert on it. I want Ron and I want Aaron and I want other people who have that skill set to help us make the best decision possible for the church, because their wisdom has been placed here by God to help us with that work. And the same is true in all the various aspects. We have educators and others that will know more about that than I'll ever know. So please live into that sense of greater autonomy, and please feel free. You don't have to clear it with me before you do something. All right, if there is an issue, I'll call you and we'll work it out. All right, this is, again, just greater autonomy. You get the point. Again, another key takeaway is this emphasis on relational ministry through team concept and self-organization. The other thing about my leadership style, and not everyone's the same, is I am more than content to let stuff fall down and it will sit there on the floor until somebody decides that they want to pick it up and run with it. I'm completely okay with letting it sit there. And I'll field the complaints. That's fine. But I'm not doing it, because I really believe everybody here, you're so talented, you're so intelligent, levels of education just through the roof. You all know how to do this. You know how to organize, right? In fact, some of the we've seen a lot of, you see headlines out of churches all the time. Unfortunately, there's a lot of scandal and terrible things, financial misappropriation or what have you. Every time when you take a deep dive on those situations, what you find is a situation, more often than not, where the pastor is the final authority on whatever the issue, and nobody can challenge, question, or what have you, and has to organize everything, whether it fits or makes sense or not. That's silly. You all can do this. I believe in you, and so please develop teams, and that's where the relational ministry part comes in. Okay. This also goes even to the concept of the teams themselves. Not everybody's going to, we've actually had a bit of a contention in the manual, not contention, but some people really want to streamline how each of the committee descriptions, they want them to have them standardized. And I get that. But you'll notice in the meetings, I've been like, well, who would like to standardize them? Because I'm not going to do it. But I like the fact that no one committee description is the same. Now, if that gets changed, that'll be a decision that you all make. I'm not going to make it, because guess what? The people that are in those groups, this is what they thought was necessary to self-organize, and it may not fit the style of A&O or CFT or what have you, and that's okay. Again, part of the Presbyterian tendency, because we're full of A-type personalities and all that kind of stuff, we tend to try to do that standardization, follow that corporate model or what have you. And again, I don't know if that's necessary. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But again, there will be a different meeting styles, different ways of doing, different ways of relating to each other. You'll have multiple interactions with each other throughout the week or the month, even more than I will have with you individually. All right? And that's okay. And so meet as you feel like you need to. And primarily, I want to see myself, I think Dave wants to see himself and other members of the staff as coming alongside you and helping to equip you to do the work that God's calling you to do. There are overlapping points of concern that require cooperation across committees. I mentioned the usher one, right? And that's also been one because everybody wants that nice, tidy, is it this committee or is it this committee? And intentionally, I'm leaving that intention, about whether it's CFT or worship, because it's on purpose. We don't want a silo where ushers only are talking about things at worship as if community fellowship and making a welcoming environment has nothing to do with the greeters. That will require some overlap, and that's okay. And that will require not me having the answers. It will require you all to start bridging the gap and communicating with the other groups and saying, we might need some help on this, or how can we work together, so on and so forth. Yes, and this one, the staff, the pastors, again, we serve to assist and equip the congregation through the groups to do ministry. We exist to assist and equip. We are not your boss. We are not the bosses of the church. Okay? We don't drive agendas. Now, look, yeah, I have a personality too. Sometimes I do. I'm not going to, sometimes I've got a pet project. So I'm not going to sit here and say I'm completely hands off. But for the most part, I don't want to drive the agendas because you all have a better sense of what's needed. All right? So please underscore this role of staff in serving and assisting. All right, and then just a question came up about how we've been communicating this. Again, we're trying to do this. We've done announcements, articles through the committees themselves. The way that even, I thought and worked some with DSF and others is that the best way to do it were through the sermon series. So we did the one on the mission statement last semester. This semester's on the vision statements. This Sunday will be the first Sunday where we'll have a representative from a committee before we do the scripture reading and the sermon. They're going to come up and tell you what community fellowship team does, and then invite people who might be interested in that. Please contact me and let me know. We want to use this as recruitment, information, paint out that vision with the sermon and the scripture reading, underscoring why we think that's so important. So we thought that would be a really effective way to communicate that vision. Last semester we did that, and then we do the new 12-week study on the new vision statements. Now, 10-minute break. Yes, all right, thank you. So let's take 10 minutes and come on back. All right, let's go ahead and reconvene. What thing's live? Yeah.
My husband just said, yeah, I know you're where you're supposed to be.
All right. So now we're going to get into, and again, my apologies in advance about this. The new Book of Order, they revised it, and I'm glad, and some of these revisions are great. The problem was the fact that they made these revisions, we have this mandate, and then we were given zero resources to carry this out. And so in this year, I wanted to make sure that we at least gave folks a basic crash course on some of these topics so that I could say that we've done this training, and this will be a part of training going forward. But this is the way that the Book of Order changed, is that according to G30106, we have to do training on sexual harassment, abuse, misconduct, anti-discrimination, and child protection. And again, I have done my best to try to get decent resources from places on the web. And again, I say all of this to say, please know this is just scratching the surface of these topics at best. It is not meant to be a final word or note on any of these topics. And I would even say you undergoing it is not sort of your get out of jail free card. I've been through that training. Well, this is more just a conversation starter, an invitation for you to maybe explore some of these things, in greater depth. So, with that being said, we are going to take on the topic of what is sexual harassment, and Will is going to play the video for us.
Sexual harassment is behaviour that's based on sex or that is sexual in nature and that is unwelcome to the person on the receiving end of it. So it's behaviour that creates an intimidating or hostile environment for the person receiving it.
So what are you studying then?
I'm doing engineering.
Engineering? What time you're going to hide that gorgeous body underneath a boiler suit all day? Shouldn't be allowed.
You're always so tense. Honestly, look at you.
Michael, sorry, but I've got to get on.
You need to learn to relax, young lady.
Sexual harassment can happen anywhere and can take many different forms. Most commonly, harassment is perpetrated by men against women. However, men can also harass other men, and women can harass men or other women.
There's a broad range of ways that sexual harassment can manifest itself. There is unwanted touching, language, inappropriate jokes. It could also be more kind of environmental, perhaps with pictures or sharing of pornography between colleagues, or the awareness that that happens. And that can make women feel second class within that workplace. It can feel that they're excluded from certain situations.
It can be the opposite way round. It can be that the women in the office are circulating pictures of men and creating an atmosphere that's degrading and humiliating for the men in that office. It goes both ways.
Oh, looks like our topless builder boys are back. Take it off, take it off, take it off. Yes.
Let's put us back again.
Let's have a look. This is what equality looks like, Sunil. You guys better get used to it.
Payback time. Yeah.
Chris, have you got a six-pack like that?
Oh, looks like you're a bit of a lost cause, Sunil. Sorry.
Again, I even want to apologize. It's not a great video, but after scouring what I could find, I thought it was at least a conversation starter. So I want you to get into your groups just for a few minutes, 3-4 minutes. And the question that I want to ask you is, what are some of the key concepts that define sexual harassment? Take 3 minutes, discuss it as a group, and then we'll talk about it for a second.
Roy Moore.
Take about a minute. All right. I want to make just a couple of comments on this issue of sexual harassment. And I'm going to say that 9 times out of 10, in my discussions with other people, the conversation quickly goes to trying to define where the lines are. right? Sort of, is this or is this, sort of finding what and it's human nature. We try to find what's the outer boundary of what's acceptable and what is not. And I would say, and this is just my opinion, that has its place, but this issue of sexual harassment, if it's just defined by these boundary conditions, we're not taking the subject seriously enough. Because at the end of the day, there are a few key concepts that are involved here, and the number one is unwelcome. All right? And this is where we can say, well, would that be welcome or not? I don't know. Is that appropriate or not? Well, one clear thing we know is if somebody either through their body language or tells you that they're uncomfortable with a comment or your position, take them at their word, all right? I mean, if it's any question whatsoever, take them at their word. Actually, one of the most uncomfortable conversations I've ever had in my pastoral experience, this was years ago. We had a number of classes that we were doing for folks, and this one guy, middle 30s, taught a class with about 6 people in it. And one was a young woman in her late 20s. And for whatever reason, he was a really nice guy. I liked him, good Christian, all this, but for whatever reason, he fell in love with her. Like he just was smitten with her. And so in class, he didn't do anything out of the way. He didn't violate any of the boundary conditions in class. But what he would do after class is he would constantly try to be next to her all the time and talk with her. He would sometimes bring gifts and stuff like this, which seems like, well, what's wrong with gifts? Well, you know what? He was not reading her body language and she would even say, no, that's not necessary. No, I really don't want your gift, all this kind of stuff. She was trying in her nice way to say, no, thank you. He was not getting the message, and it got to the point, he eventually asked her out and said no, and he was like, well, why? I just think you're awesome, all this, and she was starting to get afraid that this could turn into kind of like stalking or something. And so she came to me, and I knew the guy, and I was like, all right, well, listen, we're going to do this in a Christian way. And so we sat down. I said, let's all sit down after service, and let's talk about this. And I said, first, you, the young lady, you tell me why you're uncomfortable with this. And then I asked the guy, what do you hear when she says this? And even with her saying it explicitly, he was not getting the message. And then my job was then to say, well, look, in light of what I've heard, here are the boundary conditions. The boundary conditions are, it's most likely she's going to leave your class. I think that's the first thing. Second is no more gifts, no more asking out. And we did do it in a Christian way that, allowed people to still sort of coexist in the same space together. There is a way to deal with sexual harassment issues that isn't always bringing the hammer. But I think that if we define this concept just by these boundary conditions, we miss the point. And that is, it goes back to our vision statements. We want to create a welcoming environment at the church. All right? And look, we are human beings. We are made in the image of God. We are sexual creatures, male and female. I get all of that. However, at the end of the day, if you're at a chili cook-off event or what have you, let's focus on the chili cook-off event or the worship event, and not whether or not you want to date this person and follow them around or what have you. We may avoid at least a good bit of this. And again, I just want to underscore the unwelcome portion of this. And it can be a hard thing to hear, but I've heard it from so many women over the years, whether guys realize or not, and I'm not trying to beat up on guys, but at the end of the day, there are dynamics that are at work that can make women feel uncomfortable, that maybe we don't intend, or we have what we think to be the best intentions. And if you have a question in your mind, whether or not this might be a welcome comment or a gesture or what have you, if you've got that question, then maybe the best thing is to say, this isn't the context or the place for that, right? If it's coming up in your mind, like there's the silly Sunil one, it was the other way, like, you're a lost cause, Sunil, and as the patron of lost causes here, no, I'm just joking, but, again, it's, there had to have been something going through her mind. I wonder whether or not patting Sunil's stomach and, like this would be appropriate. If you've just got that flash in your mind, just don't. And we will avoid a great deal of this, but I do want to underscore the unwelcome portion of it, the power dynamics that are involved, and do not try to define sexual harassment primarily by these boundary conditions of can I do it or not do it, but instead focus on we as a church in our committee work and our ministry want to create a welcoming environment. If we'll do that, we will avoid the vast majority of issues that arise with this. Does that sound fair? Again, this is a crash course. It is not in depth. It is not in depth. The next thing that we're going to get into is, this is actually really important. This is off of a newscast. This is something that people get wrong like 90% of the time. The difference between sexual misconduct, harassment, and abuse and assault. These are very different things, all right? And it's almost in degree of severity. All right, but we sort of use these terms interchangeably, and that's where this video comes into play. And so I want us to take a minute and watch that.
Charlie Rose, two high-profile names at the center of sexual misconduct scandals this week alone. And you keep hearing these terms, sexual misconduct, harassment, assault, and it's confusing. So here's what they mean exactly. Sexual misconduct. It's an umbrella term including sexual harassment, assault, intimidation, and exploitation. Sexual harassment, that involves unwanted sexual advances. They can be remarks or suggestions done physically, verbally, over the phone, or via email. Sexual assault, that is when you are touched sexually without your consent, or you're forced to engage in a sexual activity against your will. And one that you haven't really heard a lot being used is sexual intimidation. So this includes indecent exposure and committing a sex act against the victim. This is all things that Harvey Weinstein, Louis C.K., and Charlie Rose have been accused of doing. And we're really at a pivotal point right now where people who abused their power and took advantage of a system that benefited them are being held to the fire. And if hearing these stories from these survivors are conjuring up any feelings in you, repressed feelings, I went to the Crisis Center of Tampa Bay and had a long talk with them about what you can do.
In the best of circumstances with sexual assault, there's a feeling of blame that goes either from the victim themselves, that feel that they blame themselves, or family, friends will blame. It's the same with sexual harassment, maybe even more so because of the nuances. But it's how it makes you feel, and you have the right to be disturbed by it and to tell somebody about it and to be believed.
And that is the key, the right to be believed. Kathleen says if you're confused about what happened to you or is currently happening to you, call 211. You need to talk to somebody neutral, someone who's going to ask you not what you were doing, wearing, or saying, but believe you. 211 is free, and they're going to guide you through the process of what to do next. Because remember, sexual harassment is a violation of your civil rights, and you don't have to live with it.
All right, we're going to break into our groups, and I want you to, you've gotten sort of, we did the harassment video, but misconduct and assault. I would like us to take a few minutes, just what are the distinctives between the three things? And just take a few minutes, what are the key features, the distinctives between sexual misconduct, harassment, and assault? And just discuss that in your groups. Take about another minute. All right, let's pull this back in. And all of these are really short videos. They're meant to be a crash course, and so I'm going to give you the crash course distinction between these three terms, topics. Remember, sexual misconduct is the umbrella term. All right, so anything that fits in these categories, that's the umbrella term, because it's misconduct of any sort in that idea. Now, harassment has to do with that key word of unwelcome, unwanted. All right, and it does have to do with how that makes that person feel. All right, you know, maybe it wasn't your intention, but if you're making that person feel that way and they communicate that to you and you continue, you're in the realm of harassment. All right, but again, it is the unwelcome, unwanted, and the assault is obviously the issue of consent. All right, and it involves sometimes physical violence, intimidation, you know, things of this nature. People don't want that, and you continue to do that anyway. When you don't give your consent, you refuse, and then you're in the realm of assault and abuse. Now, one way, harassment, because it's unwelcome and you're dealing with the subjective feelings of how someone feels about this, maybe there's been communication. One way that typically gets worked out is in civil court. Now, it does say it's a violation of your civil rights, but that will be worked out in civil court. When you're in assault and abuse, like, you know, somebody did something terrible, and I don't want to go too much into that, you're in the realm of criminal behavior, all right? That has like jail time and stuff like that, all right? So that's one way to look at it. But again, unwelcome, unwanted, and then consent issues, those are the two ways that you can distinguish those last two terms, and sexual misconduct being the umbrella term. But please note that the umbrella term encompasses both the subjective side of it, how you're making people feel unwanted or what have you, as well as even the criminal or the assault stuff as well. So I think that's important. And I would say this too, you know, when you're talking about subjective feelings on the, I hope that we will never have as a church, my prayer is that we'll have an assault abuse thing that we have to deal with. But when you're dealing in the realm of harassment, you are dealing in the realm of subjective feelings. There may be particular nuances to a case that comes up, but that unwelcome part of it is a big one. And I would say this, in that comment I made earlier, like if you have a question in your mind, again, you never know how somebody's going to take what you say. You could have any sort of other intention, you just don't know. You know, we're not mind readers. So just kind of keep that in mind, and it will give you at least a way to begin navigate. This is all about beginning to navigate this issue. I do have a few scenarios, and we'll just talk about them very briefly. So if you'll get a scenario number one there, Will.
Alicia and Matt work together in a supermarket. They've worked together for a while now, and even though Matt liked the attention at first, he's started to get uncomfortable with how Alicia behaves towards him. Is this sexual harassment?
Thank you.
Thanks. So, Matt, what are you up to this weekend?
Not much.
Are you doing any overtime on Sunday?
No, not this weekend.
Because we said that we'd meet up for a meal sometime?
Actually, I'm not really free.
Even though he liked the attention when they first met, Matt is clearly uncomfortable and Alicia's behavior is now unwanted. So this is sexual harassment. Even though it isn't professional, this behavior would not be sexual harassment if Matt welcomed it.
Lydia.
Yeah. Let's talk about that for a second. What were the key features in that very brief scenario, even like what you were seeing visually? as to why that constituted harassment. Yeah, so please keep that in mind. You know, it's not just even what people say verbally. It's obvious he doesn't want to confront, but there's the body language, right? Those are cues. Anybody else a comment about that scenario? How many times did he effectively say no beyond just body language? Like, no, I'm busy this weekend, you know, this sort of stuff. It was like that scenario many years ago. This young woman kept saying, no, I don't want, you know, I've got to be somewhere, you know, on and on and on. You know, if you want to do something with someone and every single time they're like they don't want to, there's a certain point where you have to get the message like, no, I don't want to, and just move on, right? There's definitely that. So anything else, any other comments or things that you saw in that very brief, and again, I'm so sorry for the thumbnail sketches that these provide, but anything else from this? What's that? Yeah. You know, actually, that's not a bad idea. I mean, look, you know, when I first came to this church, you know, I told people I'm not a hugger, and I'm hugging more. I'm trying to be a little more open in that way. But yeah, I mean, you know, I got a bubble issue, and you know, that's not always a bad thing. Bubbles aren't bad, and I'm going to tell you, there's a reason that I have a bubble issue. When I first got started in ministry, there were some people who didn't respect my bubble and made me very uncomfortable on Sunday morning, and so I developed a bubble. There's a reason why people have bubbles, and if you're picking up any body language that they got a bubble issue, respect their bubble issue. And that's okay. That's them. That's where they're at. Because again, what's the point? Rather than defining the outskirts of what is or is not acceptable in or out of the circle, it's the emphasis instead on welcoming environment, right? Okay. Let's look at the second video.
Emma works in a phone shop. Dominic is a courier contracted by the phone company to deliver and remove stock once a day. They are comfortable with each other and have the same sense of humor. They often flirt and joke around. Is this sexual harassment? Even though her employer may frown at this behavior, this is not sexual harassment because the feelings between Emma and Dominic are mutual. Neither of them feel embarrassed, intimidated, or feel anything negative about the interaction.
Any comments on this one? What did you see in the body language? I can't underscore the body language enough. Body language is huge. And look, I'm a guy. Guys, I love you. We're not good body language people. We don't pick those cues up as easily or as well. But what did you pick up in the body language? Yeah, they're comfortable. They're right up next to each other, you know, arm around. Nobody's like, oh, you know, none of the waves slide or anything of that nature, you know? Yeah. Again, it's the comfort level. And it's, you know, and I would say this, it's likely that they did not get to that comfort level just the first time that they met. There's probably been a work relationship, 6 months, a year, however long, where they've gotten comfortable, where they're okay with expressing whatever, you know, affection they have for each other. And there was nothing like, I didn't see any PDA in that, you know, but, you know, they were okay with it. It doesn't happen overnight. Yeah. Yeah, that's a huge one. Eye contact. If you are talking with somebody and they're not making eye contact with you, again, I'm just giving you guys cliff notes. Eye contact is huge, right? And so if people are making very good eye contact, there's some level of comfort. If there's not a lot of eye contact, there's some discomfort. It can just be maybe they are a little intimidated by you or what have you, and maybe just be a little more wary or on your guard in that situation. Any others? All right, now this one is from the Archdiocese, I forget where in Canada, And this is actually a church event scenario. I tried to find church events too.
Hi, Julie. How's it going?
I'm fine. Actually, I was thinking this morning it's been a year tomorrow since I've been coming here. I can't believe how much better my life is.
Yeah, well, time really does fly. Well, congratulations, Julie.
Thanks. And I was wondering if you wanted to come to my place for dinner, just so I can say thank you. I mean, you've always been so helpful and so kind to me.
Pause here for discussion. Now, stuff like this happens all the time, both men towards women, women towards men. You know, it just does. We're human beings. All right? What did you see in the video?
She was eager.
What?
She was eager.
Yeah. How in what way? What? And again, I know it's over dramatized, but in this over dramatized sense, what suggests that to you?
She spoke first. She stepped forward. She came close. She reached her hand. She made an invitation.
Yeah.
She looked into his eyes.
Yeah. Yeah. Eye contact was too good. Yeah. Yeah. She will not be getting an Emmy award or whatever for her performance. It was a little too much there. The other one, too, is, you know, there's the stuff like fixing hair, you know, the grooming behaviors and stuff like this that's going on. And we didn't see a whole lot, which we'll see in a minute. We didn't get to see his reaction to it. But very clearly, and again, imagine from a guy's, if there was a guy doing that towards a female staff member, you know, there are other ways. And again, I think there's the proximity, there can be the eye stuff, there can be the reaching out and the touching. Clearly something's being communicated here, all right? And the question is what do we do in that kind of scenario? You're going to pause there.
That's so nice of you, Joey. And it has been a pleasure assisting you over the past year. But since I'm a volunteer here, I'm not allowed to visit a client's home unless it's for a delivery. And even then, there has to be at least 2 volunteers present. It's just to protect your privacy and safety. You do understand, right?
Again, it's a little over dramatized. What did you see in the reaction? She had a big letdown, disappointment. What? Yeah. Yeah, she did. Please notice this. There was the rule that he followed that he was not going to be alone. Now, I would say at a minimum, as officers of the church, meeting alone in someone's house is not a good idea, all right? So either you have 2 options, and we do the same thing, and we'll talk about it with child protection policies. You either go what they call 2 deep, that's the Boy Scout rule or the scouting rule. So it's either maybe an elder and somebody else that's with you, or if you do meet, it has to be in a public place. All right, and that's okay. I mean, we've got buddies, we got male-female buddies here, and we encouraged you to, pray and talk to each other. And we mentioned have coffee. Now, we didn't say have coffee at your house alone, just you two, but it's completely appropriate if you want to go to Starbucks and have coffee, you're in a public place. All right, but it is being aware of the fact that there are some strictures around this that it will protect you and ultimately will protect the church. And I think also clearly communicating that, will also protect you, from some of those things there. And just, again, I would also say be aware of people's body language and other things of that nature. Those do tend to be really big indicators, even more than the verbal. All right? Now, I linked something here from slate.com. I'm going to tell you it's a horror story. Here's a horror story. So Amy Butler used to be the senior pastor of Riverside Presbyterian Church in New York City. And she served there for a number of years. And all of a sudden, something broke out, and it was covered in the New York Times and Post, and even here on slate.com. And eventually, after a prolonged legal battle, she was given severance, she left, she resigned. But the issue was that Amy, with a retreat, I believe it was like 5 or 6 members of her staff, they were out at some kind of conference, and Amy decided that she was going to take the members of the staff to an adult store. And at the adult store, she then proceeded to buy adult toys for every member of the staff, and would go on. Again, her theology was such that she's. And I would say there is a portion of this. I think that we do the church a disservice by pretending that we're not sexual beings. All right, look, there are no. I don't know. Maybe I don't think there are any choir angels in here. I'm not a choir angel, or I'm not an angel in general. We just are, and there are things that people do in the privacy of their homes and with partners and stuff, and I don't want to get into that conversation. And if Amy is there to such where she wants to walk into an adult store, that's between Amy and God and not me, and I'm not going to judge that. The issue was the fact that in taking members of her staff to the adult store, there were a couple members of the staff that expressed to Amy that they were really uncomfortable going to the adult store, and then also uncomfortable with the gift, the adult toy gift. And the fact that she dismissed their concerns and gave it anyway, and then those employees went on to report that, these are the issues, she did, again, there was a communication, discomfort, all that kind of stuff, and them trying to say no and she not respecting that boundary. In the end, the church was successful in negotiating the departure because not on the quote-unquote moral issue of, pastor went to the adult store, which gets into, whose theology is going to prevail there. The issue that allowed the church to be successful was the fact that she did not respect the boundaries of other members of her staff when they said, I'm uncomfortable, no, I really don't want this adult toy, that kind of stuff, all right? Now, I'm not saying that this is an object lesson, for us, I promise you, I'm never going to take any member of the staff to an adult store. We're not going to have to deal with that, but at the end of the day, it does underscore that, you never know how other people are going to take what you say or you do. And you just have to be cognizant of that. And this is so key for leadership in general, is listening. Listening, not just with your ears, but with eyes, body language, other things of that nature. If we'll spend more time being cognizant and aware of that, we will avoid some of those issues. And unfortunately, Amy and that church had to go through what they went through, all right? So, with that being said, we're going to move on now to being a witness. Yeah, let me, sorry. There we go.
we're all bystanders all of the time in our everyday and working lives, and there's a very important role for bystanders in that quite often cultures that are supportive of sexual harassment seem supportive because nobody's speaking out. So while there may be one or two people whose behaviour is unacceptable in the workplace, it's difficult for them to know how unacceptable that behaviour is if nobody's ever calling them out on it.
Nice one, son.
Hey, just sharing the love, people. Just sharing the love.
You know, when I started working here, it was topless calendars. I thought we moved on, but obviously not. You really are pathetic.
No, seriously, mate. It's not on.
What's up with you, Mildred? You not getting any?
And what if that was your sister? And some guy was sending nudes to his mates? Think about it. You'd want to kill him. Grow up.
Bystanders can intervene in a number of different ways, and the most effective approach will obviously depend on the situation.
For example, using humour can help to reduce tension and make it easier to get your point across.
Bringing it home stops the person from distancing themselves from the impact of their actions or dehumanizing their victims.
We're friends, right? Appealing to someone as a friend shows that you care about the way they are perceived by others.
That's just weird. Giving normative feedback can help put unacceptable behavior in context.
There's safety and power in numbers. So, intervening as a group gives you a strong basis for action and can be particularly effective with someone who displays a pattern of behavior.
So I'm looking at the time. I don't know if we can get into the discussion so much, and I do apologize for that. But I do want to underscore the fact that we actually have had interactions at the church here that have been tense, you know, and I won't get into the specific contexts. And people's natural disposition is to do what? It's to back away, right? It makes us uncomfortable. It can be a negative interaction between, you know, partners or former partners or something of that nature. You know, look, I get it. It makes everybody uncomfortable when something is going on and the air is tense. You can cut it with a knife. However, if we're going to do that work of being a welcoming community, then we have to, especially as leaders, have the courage to step in and say, you know, and again, using the things like humor, bringing it home, stuff like this, it's a way to point out. You can do it in a not ugly way. You can do it in a way that is loving or what have you, but it lets and it communicates to the people involved that this does not help create that welcoming environment, and that needs to stop. Because here's the thing, is that sometimes you do run into situations of pattern abusers, pattern harassers, things of this nature, and 9 times out of 10, there haven't been people in the community or workplace willing to step in and say, stop. And guess what happens when someone's able to do something 9, 10, 11, 12, 15, 30, 40, 50 times? They get a reinforcement in their mind that this is acceptable behavior. And when they step over that line again, then suddenly it's like, well, I've done this 50 times before. Why are you telling me now that that's unacceptable? You know, we're not helping the person, whether it be the pattern harasser or abuser or what have you. We're certainly not helping the victim of it, because the one thing that I can say from the victim standpoint that I've heard time and time again is the fact that how not just humiliating that behavior is how isolating that behavior makes them feel. They feel like they're in a world of 4 walls the size, I mean, talk about bubbles, when you're placed in that situation and nobody's paying attention, nobody's saying anything, it's you versus this other person, and there's no one there. You have to deal with it on your own, as well as all the emotions that come with being on the receiving end of that. And that can be debilitating for people, because that pattern abuser or pattern harasser may have done it to that person, but that person may have had that done to them 5, 6, 7, 8 times, and the same reinforcement mechanism is involved with them. Why is it that I keep getting harassed? And look, attractive people, it happens to them, quite a bit. And, that can make them just feel fundamentally insecure about their existence in life. It can make them sort of throw up walls that it's very hard to get past, when maybe there is a person that could be the loving, caring, partner or friend that they're looking for, but they've learned a pattern, unfortunately, that the world is a place where, they get constantly harassed or whatever it is. And look, I haven't seen this in Bristol. I'm not saying it doesn't. It's just I haven't witnessed it. But when I lived, outside New York, you hear about the catcalling and stuff like this. It happens. If I show of hands, I don't want to play. You don't have to raise your hand if you don't. Any of the ladies here, you ever experienced anything like a catcall or felt harassed in a workplace environment or something like that? How did that? If you don't have to share, how did that make you feel? Invisible. Visible in the wrong way and invisible in the way that matters. They didn't see who you were.
It makes you feel afraid. Scared for your physical safety.
Yeah. I'm getting ready to send my daughter to college. And some of the most uncomfortable discussions I've had to have with her. I've had to have the dad sit down, and I've given her like the rules of the road. I hope when she gets to college that she doesn't like pick up drinking or something like that. But, I'm just, I've given her the rules, like when you go, if you're, one of the places she's looking at, VCU has an outstanding art program. She got into the art program there, and we're still like Richmond, but it's a really good school for this. I don't know. We've lived in Richmond. We know. And my rules of the road were, like, if you do go to VCU, and we'll see what the other ones come in, your rules of the road are, if you go out publicly, whether it's to class or with friends, or make sure it's in a group. I said, I hope that you'll make wise decisions when it comes to hanging out with friends and whether or not you consume alcohol or not. But I told her, don't you ever one time ever take any open drink from anybody. Now think about it how many guys in here, and I'm not asking you to confess if you're alcoholics or something. I'm just saying, like, you've ever been at a party and you've had to wonder if somebody got you a drink, whether or not you could drink that? I haven't. My daughter, I made sure that she knew, don't you ever one time take an open drink from anybody. You don't know, because unfortunately things like this happen. I won't continue to use my daughter. I don't want to use my daughter as a but example. But those were two big rules of the road that I wanted to give her. I gave her some others. And so I think it's just being cognizant of the fact that at the end of the day, one way that I would hope that as a father, if you saw interactions with, in the congregation with my daughter, and you saw, one more example. She works at J. Frank's, right? And she's the hostess. Unfortunately, and my son told me this, and I wanted to go find the guy. There's a guy in his early 40s that comes to J. Frank's very often, and he's constantly trying to get. My daughter's in high school, trying to get up next to her, saying stuff, and she's trying to get away from him, to the point when Sammy saw it, he literally had to interpose his body. This older man was creeping on an underage girl. This kind of stuff happens, and I thank God for Sammy. At least I told him one thing right. He's going to take care of his sister. But again, Sammy's not always going to be there. As leaders, we are going to be there, And it is if we see something, we have to say something. We don't have to be ugly. We don't have to automatically jump in and slap handcuffs on people, but just being present and making the people not feel invisible, isolated, intimidated, or scared can be a game changer, not just for the victim, but can be a game changer also for the perpetrator, because they learn that that's not acceptable here. Yeah. Point. Thank you for sharing that. That's an excellent point. So there's a variety of ways of not just being a bystander, of preventing and living into that idea of what we're trying to create is a welcoming environment. Yes?
In a curriculum that I've looked at, they use some language, and we don't want to be possums.
Mm-hmm.
We roll over and let things happen, but we want to be gentle protectors in our community. And I really like that because there are predators among us.
Yes. Yes, there are. And that's a key feature. You know, I went through the scouting youth protection training. It's it's not funny. It's ironic that predators will tend to go towards systems, institutions where they see vulnerabilities and weaknesses, where they see people not willing to intervene, say anything. There's not policies. Things are really loose. Those are the environments. They know it's a low accountability environment, and they will seek those out. And there's only one way, if we don't want to be a community that is preyed upon that way, is to become an accountable environment. All right, we are running way behind, and so I'm going to take this one's a 5-minute break, and we're going to skip a video, and then we're going to get into racial discrimination and bias. So go ahead and take 5 minutes very quickly, and we'll come back. Yeah. Uh-huh. All right, we're going to get into the stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, and there are a lot of distinctions and definitions to talk about with this. I think this is one, I'm actually glad that it's here. We need to be sensitive to this. You know, and I'm speaking as someone who has a multiracial family. You know, and I don't mean to say this to offend anybody. My children are not white. They're half Korean and they're half white Anglo-American. And, you know, they've had to exist in sort of two spaces at one time. Sometimes they're comfortable, sometimes they're not. And I think the degree to which we make ourselves more cognizant of some of these things will help us create that welcoming environment that I know we all want to be. I say all of this as a preface too, because I know that this can be a contentious issue that brings up a lot of emotions in people, and you know, I'm not that way, this sort of stuff. Again, the point isn't recrimination, it's not labeling. The point is awareness and just being sensitive to this, because there are people that have to exist in spaces that we don't have to exist in necessarily, and the more that we're aware of that, we can create that welcoming environment that we want to have here as a church. So we're going to open up with this video on the ABCs of stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination.
Dr. Drew and my wife Susan here, we want to show you something.
This is what just 10 pounds of body fat looks like. If we want to drop this...
In this quick video, I just want to break down some terms that we use in psychology that kind of get used in the same way out in the world, but we actually gain a lot by being able to see how these words are different from each other. And those words are stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. And sometimes we use these words interchangeably, but I want to just quickly go over how they're different and what each of them means. And we can apply what psychologists sometimes call the ABCs to understanding what the differences are. The A stands for affect. The psychologists use this word differently than most people. You might see this and see the word affect, but when psychologists see this word, they pronounce it affect. And when they pronounce it that way, they mean feelings. So our affect is our mood, our feelings. Affective experience are our emotional experience, etc. So we can think of A for affect. We can also think of A for attitude. And that belongs to prejudice. So when we talk about prejudice, we're talking about our attitudes. And it really just means our overall positive or negative association with a particular social group. So if someone has a prejudice about a group, it means they generally see that group as positive or as negative. Usually when we use the word prejudice, we're thinking of the negative side of things, right? So if one group says, I hate this other group, right? If you think of anti-Semitism, right? We'd say that's a harsh negative prejudice about Jewish people. And that's usually the kind of prejudice that we're talking about, these negative prejudices. But you could have positive prejudices as well. If you go, oh, I love Canadians, that would be a positive prejudice, right? It's an overall generally positive association that you have with that social group. So affect or attitude goes with prejudice. The B in our ABCs is behavior. These are the actions that we take, the choices that we make, how we treat other people. And discrimination is the behavioral side of this equation. So discrimination is what happens when you treat someone differently based on the group they belong to, right? So if there's a reliable pattern where someone is treating some people better or worse than others, and the primary difference between them is their social identity, their social category, the group that they belong to, we'd call that discrimination, right? So if you notice that someone at restaurants always tips white waiters higher than black waiters, that would be discrimination. This person hasn't necessarily said anything or thinks anything about this group, but what we're looking at are their actions. Their choice to tip a higher amount is being driven by the race of the person that's receiving that money. And that's just one example. So discrimination is what happens when our actions are biased by the social category that the other person belongs to. The final part of the ABCs is our C, which stands for cognition. In psychology, we use this word cognition to talk about thinking and what happens mentally, our beliefs and our thoughts. This is cognition, and that is what belongs to stereotypes. So stereotypes are beliefs we have about another group, the assumptions that we make, the expectations we have. So if we've come to associate Canadians with a smiling disposition, that's a stereotype, right? If I expect a Canadian to be a happy-go-lucky person just because they're Canadian, if that's all I know about them, I'm stereotyping, right? I have a belief about this group and the kind of people they are, and I'm using it to bias my expectations of a particular person because they belong to that group. So those are our ABCs. Prejudice, which is the attitude, overall positive or negative judgment of another group. Discrimination, which is our behavior, how we're acting in response to one group versus another. And stereotypes, the beliefs we have about the other group. Now, of course, I've made a big deal about how these three things are separate from each other, but oftentimes they're related, right? When someone has negative beliefs about a group, they expect them to act poorly, they think they have a bunch of negative qualities, that is likely to be associated with a negative prejudice toward that group, right? If I believe that you have all these bad qualities, I probably don't like you very much, right? So those two things would go together, but they don't have to, right? Someone can have a belief about a group that has nothing to do with prejudice, right? If I think Canadians smile a lot, okay, that's a stereotype, but it has no effect on whether I like this person or not because they are Canadian. You could also have prejudice and stereotyping without it necessarily leading to discrimination, although, sure, if people expect some groups to be mean or rude, their behavior toward those groups might be one of avoidance or not engaging very respectfully with them. And so, sure, people's behaviors can be tied to their stereotypes. Or if you don't like a particular group, you might act more rude or aggressively toward that group, right? So it makes logical sense that prejudice and stereotypes would be related to discrimination, but they don't have to be. People could have stereotypes, they could have prejudice, and not act on them, right? So again, these things can be separated from each other. And our job as psychologists is to understand those dynamics. When are they connected to each other? When are they not? But it's important for us not to lump all these three terms together, because when we distinguish them, the questions that we get to ask become a little more sophisticated and nuanced, and we get a better sense of how these things work. Okay, quick review. I'm going to show you a handful of statements that a person might make, and I want you to guess whether we're talking specifically about a stereotype that this person has or a prejudice that this person has. Number one, let's say somebody says, librarians are old. Is that a stereotype or a prejudice? In this case, it's a stereotype. It's a belief somebody has about librarians. There's not necessarily any judgment in it. There's not necessarily any feelings in this. It's just somebody's expectation that if they meet a librarian, they're probably going to be older than someone in another occupation. Okay, number two, teenagers don't work hard. What is this, stereotype or prejudice? In this case, we're talking again about a stereotype. It's a belief about teenagers. It's this expectation that people from this group don't work as hard. Sure, maybe that might lead to prejudice, but all by itself, this statement is not prejudice. It's just a stereotype. Okay, what about someone who says, I hate gamers? Stereotype or prejudice? Here we're talking prejudice. This is a judgment. They're not endorsing any belief about gamers. They're not saying what gamers are like or what characteristics they have. They're just saying that they don't like them. It's a negative prejudice toward this group. Okay, last one. Let's say someone says, I love Southerners. Is this a stereotype or a prejudice? Here we're talking prejudice, just like before. It's maybe modestly tricky because it's a positive prejudice and it's not usually what we think of when we think about prejudice, But this person is not saying anything in particular about what Southerners are like or their characteristics or attributes. They're just saying they have an overall positive feeling about this group. And so therefore, we'd call that a prejudice. Okay, that's the difference between stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Hopefully knowing the distinctions between these terms helps you identify them differently when you see it in the world around you, and as a result, you can appreciate some of the nuance behind the psychology of these three things, how they're related, and when they're related, and when they're not. For more social psychology, subscribe to this YouTube channel, or check out my podcast at opinionsciencepodcast.com.
All right, so I don't have time, looking at the time to break out into groups. I just want to say something as it relates to our role. We had the ABCs. We have attitude, behaviors, and cognition. Now, my job, or the job of the church, we're not thought police. And my job is not to judge the inner recesses of your heart or what have you. You may have cognition portions of what you think about particular groups that I may never know and you may never reveal, and that is ultimately between you and God. It can be positive too, but again, at the end of the day, our job as officers or what have you is not to be thought police. Now, I will try to persuade you using the gospel that we maybe don't have negative cognition or, these thoughts and things of this nature towards other groups, but I can't convince you one way or the other. Now, where we get into, instead of trying to define boundary lines of what's acceptable and what's not, or what's on the outside of it, and trying to come up with these breakdown cases, I would say to you that when we get into the B's of the behaviors, there are things that as a church and as officers that are acceptable and unacceptable. All right? And so that comes down to, are we going to be that welcoming community that we want to be and we talk about, or are we not? And when it comes to behaviors specifically around race, but any number of issues, it has to do with the fact that at the end of the day, that negative behaviors of excluding or making people not feel welcome will not be acceptable at the church. Now, again, I can't police your cognition about what you think about other people. But as a group, we will be held accountable as to whether or not you make other people feel welcome or excluded or things of that nature. And I would also say that we get into a gray area when it comes to attitudes. Now, we all love Southerners. We know that. You can have positive prejudices. We also have, and we're going to be talking about implicit versus explicit bias in a minute. We can have a lot of attitudes that are socially conditioned. We learn them. I think the key here is if we do have certain attitudes towards groups and things of that nature, it's a matter of maybe exposure and just being aware that maybe we have these attitudes or dispositions, how we feel about others, whether we love Southerners or hate gamers or whatever it happens to be. But I do think as officers, we do have a call to be aware of those things and at a minimum work on them, have a conversation about them with the clear idea that the boundary breakdown is going to be around behaviors. All right, at all points, regardless of who we're talking about, everyone will be made to feel welcome when they walk through the doors or participate in a committee and things of that nature. And I do make you a promise that though I will try to persuade you if you happen to have a negative cognitive bias against someone, I will try to make the argument and persuade you to not have that. At the same time, I am not the thought police, and it is not my job to be God. Yes? Yeah. Yeah. Well, and again, I would agree with you. And if they're plying trade out in front of the church, we'll certainly, and again, what is the breakdown case in the one that you just mentioned? It's the behavior, right? So we have these internal maybe dispositions or internal thoughts, But at the end of the day, the breakdown where we will act as a group is around behavior. So in your case, you know, again, just based on what you said, plying trade, we're certainly going to say, you know, no, you cannot ply trade here. And we also, maybe when it comes to the prejudice piece, and this gets into the gray area, you can come alongside, and here I would, if you don't mind me using your example of coming alongside someone, there's a way to actually communicate our attitudes or what we think in a non-confrontational way that will not alienate the other person. So rather than me standing up on a pulpit and saying, and again, I'm just being over the top on this, Bible says, oh, prostitutes and harlots, they're going to hell, like this, and you know, rather than doing that, maybe the call of the church is to come alongside that person, just as Jesus did, in a non-confrontational way, and say, as he did to the woman found in adultery, go and sin no more. And it changed her life. Yeah. Yeah. So again, we got A, B, C's, attitudes, behaviors, cognition. We're not the thought police, but, you know, I will try to persuade you the other way. Behaviors will always be the breakdown thing by which we, you know, it's in or out, acceptable, unacceptable. And when it comes to attitudes, there are ways that we'll have a variety of attitudes depending on all sorts of different groups. But there's a way for us to get ourselves into the conversation alongside of people in a non-confrontational way that will not alienate people. And again, what is our core conviction that we saw in so many of our vision statements and our mission statement? We want to be a welcoming community where people can hear the gospel that Jesus is Lord. And if we're cognizant of that, we can get that work done. Okay? Because again, it's not about us or even our attitudes, biases, prejudice, and all these other things. It's about Jesus. And are we being good ambassadors? All right? All right, with that being said, we're going to get into a discussion sort of about implicit versus explicit bias. This is always a hard one for people, and I think it's important. It's a little bit longer of a video, but he gets onto some of the subjects. So let's get on to the next one, implicit versus explicit bias.
Consider that New Year's resolutions are not the answer for you this year. You need real solutions, and therapy can help with that.
I want to make an argument to you. I want to make a case to you. And the argument that I want to make is that the way that we currently think about, talk about, and act on issues of racial bias and other lines of difference in this country is woefully inadequate and it's incomplete. The way we think about, talk about, and act on issues of racial bias and other lines of difference in this country is woefully inadequate and it's incomplete. And in making this case, I want to build on the very robust and compelling evidence that has been coming out of the science community for the past 10 plus years that suggests that if we want to move to a radically different place, a radically better place on issues of race and difference in this country, we have to pay attention to something called implicit bias. So what is implicit bias? Oprah Winfrey has talked about it. Malcolm Gladwell has written about it. Normally we say when Oprah is talking about it and Malcolm is writing about it, everybody knows about it, which isn't always the case. So a bias is a preference for or a prejudice against a person or a group of people. There are three characteristics that make a bias implicit. Characteristic number one, implicit biases operate at the subconscious level, outside of conscious awareness. We don't know that we have them, and they can't be accessed through introspection. In other words, the science of implicit bias says that none of us can sit here in this room right now, scratch our heads, and wonder out loud, do I have a bias against men, against women, against black people, against white people, against immigrants, and expect to accurately answer that question because the nature of an implicit bias is such that we don't know that we have them. Characteristic number 2, implicit biases oftentimes run contrary to our conscious stated beliefs about who we are as human beings and what our values are. In other words, the science of implicit bias says that you can be a school administrator and say that you are deeply committed to nurturing and building up young people, and yet be the same school administrator who leads your school in high rates of suspensions and expulsions of young people. And both of those things would be true. Consciously, you're deeply committed to building young people up. Unconsciously, you're doing harm in the process. The science of implicit bias says that you can be a law enforcement officer deeply committed to the mantra that appears on the side of police vehicles that says what? Protect and serve. And yet be the same law enforcement officer who leads your precinct or your district in high rates of stops and frisks of young men of color. And both of those things would be true. Consciously, you're deeply committed to the principles of protecting and serving. Unconsciously, your behavior is inconsistent with that. The third characteristic that makes a bias implicit is that implicit biases are triggered through rapid and automatic mental associations that we make between people, ideas, and objects, and the attitudes and stereotypes that we hold about those people, ideas, and objects. And so, case in point, I want to do a quick exercise around the power of mental association. So in a minute, I'm going to flash a few words on the screen. And what I want to ask you to do is I want you to quickly reflect on and or call out the associations that you make with those words or that you believe the broader society makes with those words. And so this requires a little bit of call and response. So, government. Corporate. Suburbs. Subsidized housing. So the science of implicit bias would say that those associations that you just made, those aren't mere verbal associations. Those aren't mere mental associations. The science says that there are attitudes and behaviors that we attach to those associations. So imagine if, as part of my introduction, I came out here and I said, my name is Deshaw. I want to talk with you about something innovative.
The virus that causes shingles is sleeping. Wake up to your shingles risk because shingles could wake up in you.
Hey, you have an hour this week, right? Yeah. Great. I can teach you how to play 100 songs on piano in an hour. No.
And I'm here representing local government. I used to work in corporate America. I was born and raised in subsidized housing, but I now live in the suburbs of Alexandria, Virginia. The science would suggest that for many of you, for those who said that your automatic mental association with government is corrupt, or your automatic mental association with corporate is greed, you would receive me through that filter, oftentimes at the unconscious level. And it would color for you every single word that comes out of my mouth. So that's how implicit bias works. These rapid and automatic mental associations that shape and mold behavior every single day, oftentimes in ways that we're not even aware of, oftentimes in ways that do harm to others. So there are three reasons why focusing on implicit bias at this particular moment in time is important, and why I believe that a focus on implicit bias can help move this country forward. So, number one, an implicit bias focus gives us a much more expansive diagnosis of the challenges that we face in this country with respect to difference. What do I mean? We know from the work of esteemed scholars Mazarin Banaji and Anthony Greenwald that a significant amount of the harm being experienced and transmitted in this country with respect to racial bias and other lines of difference, we know that a significant amount of that harm stems from implicit forms of bias in addition to explicit forms of bias. Yet the majority of the tools that we use to address bias are designed to address explicit forms, not the implicit. So in essence, what we have in this country is a mismatch, a disconnect between how we diagnose challenges around difference and how we treat them. An implicit bias approach gives us a much more expansive diagnosis and a much more expansive toolbox. And my belief is that if we get the diagnosis right, we will get the treatment right. If we continue to get the diagnosis wrong, we will get the treatment. Number two, implicit bias is both predictive and it's preventive. Predictive in the sense that a person can go to the website for Project Implicit, take any one of the online implicit association tests, and receive a test result that can serve as a predictor of discriminatory behavior. It's preventive in the sense that there are emerging and promising strategies coming out of the science community that suggest with internal motivation and habitual practice, we can do things to reduce our vulnerability to act on our biases. And I believe that that is what the country needs right now. We need a prevention approach around issues of bias and difference versus an emergency room response. Right now, we have an emergency room response. We wait for stuff to happen, then we rush to the emergency room. We need a prevention approach, and implicit bias gives us that.
I never thought as a pediatrician that I would be at all useful in a war. My name is Seema Jalani.
Lastly, in number three, implicit bias, or an implicit bias approach, helps to reduce the shame and the shaming that's associated with talking about and addressing issues of bias. Author and researcher Brene Brown draws an interesting distinction between guilt and shame. She says, guilt says, I made a mistake and I can do something about it. Shame says, I am a mistake. This is who I am. I'm a horrible human being. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm going to always be this way. And what I want to submit to you is that my belief is that one of the biggest challenges that we have in this country and how we address issues of bias is that we engage in self-shaming, and if we're honest, sometimes we intentionally and unintentionally shame others. And my belief is that as long as we continue to do that, human beings would never feel the motivation that they need to do the self-change work or the broader societal change work that we need to do. An implicit bias approach addresses this because it makes the central question not are you racist or not racist, are you sexist or not sexist. An implicit bias approach makes the central question, how do we get our actions and behaviors, how do we align our actions and behaviors with our consciously held egalitarian beliefs, or at least for those people who do hold egalitarian beliefs. And my belief is that many people do. So that's why this work is important at this particular moment in time. And in closing, I want to leave you with a quick idea. The late child psychologist Yuri Bronfenbrenner once said that every child needs at least one adult in his or her life who is irrationally crazy about him or her. Raise your hand if you've had that at any point in your life. And so you know what it feels like. My belief is that not only does every child need that, but every human being needs at least one other human being in their life who is irrationally crazy about him or her. And the only way that we're going to have that is if we do the internal change work that we need to do to make the external change work possible. Thank you very much.
So just a few additional notes. So there's implicit versus explicit bias. And remember how we were talking about stereotypes and prejudice, and the dividing line for us was going to be around behaviors, and their acceptable and unacceptable behaviors, because we want to be a welcoming community. That helps us also understand the distinction between explicit and implicit. Explicit is the stuff that you see, the terrible stuff that you see where people say and do racially or other bias charged things, like, go on, y'all saw the thing in Charlottesville, we will not be, what was it? We will not be erased or something like that, with the tiki torches. That was an explicit case of people having these racial ideas about what this country is or what have you. That's an easy dividing line. We can look at that and say, you know what, that's pretty racist, and we're not going to do that. And so that's the same dividing line for us. The challenge in this is implicit. As he said, it's very internalized. And one thing he didn't mention is that implicit bias is largely the result of environment. Largely the result of environment. It is the result of the 1,001 messages you receive from the time you're born up through your raising about different groups or different people or what have you, and it takes on that subconscious level about it. And I'll give you an example of this. My daughter, again, half Korean, half Anglo-American, white, what have you. She's in her class, she's in calculus. How do you think she's doing? Because, all Asians are great at math. My daughter hates math. She's an artist. Now, is that the first thing that comes to mind when you think about Asian? No, it's math. Well, again, this is relatively benign. It can be not benign in certain contexts. I'm just trying to low bar to this conversation, all right? But at the end of the day, that is a result of an implicit bias. And the bias is we hear the stories of maybe great Chinese or Korean or Japanese mathematicians or engineers, or, I know in the 80s, Japan was going to take over the world in technology and all this kind of stuff. We've heard these stories for such a long time. The implicit bias is that all Asians are good at math. I've lived in Asia. There are a lot of good Asians that are good at math. There are a lot of Asians that are not good at math, and I've met them and know them. My daughter can do it. She hates it. My wife is fantastic at it. Great. I was very selective in who I was going to share the gene pool with. Got to deal with my deficiencies, right? So at the end of the day, that's a benign example of an implicit bias that's a result of 1,001 lessons we've learned along the way. And the key here is, and I really like the fact, is the key here is not the shame. It's not to shame people into submission. The key is just the cognition of the fact that all of us carry around biases. That doesn't make you a dyed-in-the-wool racist or whatever it is, bigot or what have you. It's just acknowledging that they're there. And the funny thing is, it's been there since the beginning of the church. What was the implicit and oftentimes explicit bias that when you read a majority of the Pauline epistles and others that the church had to contend with? It was the distinction, go ahead, between Jews and Gentiles. Jews thought Gentiles were dirty, pig-eating pagans, and Gentiles thought that Jews were backwater troublemakers. They didn't get along, and here's now this church where these people have to wrestle with these things. And here's where I want to share scripture with you and why I think it's important for us to pay attention to this. Again, not out of a sense of wanting to shame people, but be that welcoming environment. It is Romans 12:2. And Paul says this, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. What is Paul telling us here? That he's saying you all are coming out of different cultures with all sorts of assumptions and ways of being in the world and what you think is going on. And the call in Jesus Christ is to be aware of those old patterns are falling away. I need to be aware, and I need to be renewed in my mind with an attitude of realizing Jesus Christ at the center of our community, calling us to be a welcoming community together in his name, and learning how to coexist in the same space. You can't do that work if you're not willing to take the first step of saying, I am the product of an environment that has taught me 1,000,001 lessons about what to expect and not expect, and move on from that. And this applies, again, to race and a whole variety of issues. I just want to keep us centered on, we want to be a welcoming community. How can we do that? We have 15 minutes. I'm going to push I'm really sorry. I don't want to make 3 training sessions, so I try to fit it all in one. We're going to have... we're going to move on from this to child protection. We have this longer video on child protection we're going to watch, and I'm going to talk about mandatory reporting.
To protect our children from child abuse and neglect, we all need to recognize it and know how to make a report. It's important to be able to recognize the basic types of child abuse and their effects on children, and understand the guidelines for reporting suspected child abuse or neglect. Why is this important? Over 3 million reports were made to Child Protection Services in our country in 2011, involving more than 6 million children. Over 670,000 cases were substantiated, 75% of which were neglect. Over 1,500 children died from child abuse or neglect, and 80% of the perpetrators were their parents. Who are the children affected often by child abuse or neglect? Children who are less than 1 year of age have the highest rate of victimization. Overall, girls and boys are equally affected, but more girls are sexually abused and more boys are fatally injured. Having an unrelated caregiver living in the home increases the risk of child abuse or neglect. But it's important to remember that any child of any age, from any family, from any community, may be a victim of child abuse or neglect. The basic types of child maltreatment include physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect can take on a variety of forms, including physical needs, medical and dental needs, or educational needs. Physical abuse is any kind of non-accidental injury that results from the act of omission or commission on the part of a parent, guardian, or custodian. So it could be something that the parent did do or something that they didn't do that results in the harm. Injuries are often the result of punching, beating, kicking, biting, shaking, throwing, or otherwise harming a child. But it's important to recognize that it may not have been the intent of the individual to harm the child as severely as they did, but nonetheless, they did inflict the injury, and it is therefore physical abuse. Physical abuse often involves the head, face, and neck, and these injuries occur in more than half the cases of child physical abuse. Sexual abuse is any kind of sexual activity that is inappropriate for the child's age, level of development, or role within the family. This conceptual definition helps differentiate what may be normal sexual experimentation among 2 4-year-olds that is clearly distinct and different from sexual activity between a 4-year-old and an adult. These activities can include fondling a child's genitals, penetration, incest, rape, sodomy, indecent exposure, and exploitation. It also includes pornography. And neglect is the failure to provide for a child's basic needs. Those basic needs include necessary food, clothing, shelter, and appropriate supervision, one of the most common causes for neglect. Medical neglect includes not paying attention or providing for necessary medical or mental health treatment. And educational neglect is failure to educate a child or attend to their special education needs. Emotional neglect is inattention to the child's emotional needs. Emotional abuse is a pattern of behavior between the child and parent that damages a child's emotional development or sense of self-worth. This can include activities such as constantly terrorizing and frightening the child intentionally, ignoring the child, isolating them frequently, or corrupting and exploiting the child. Those would be activities such as having the child sell your drugs because the child won't get as much trouble as the parent would. And constant rejection of the child is another form of emotional abuse. In order to identify child abuse or neglect, one must be willing to consider the possibility that it occurs. If you don't think about it, you won't ask the right questions, and you will not make that call that could save a child's life. There are a number of red flags, or those big markers, that should make you think about the possibility of child maltreatment. It's important to recognize that as you see lists of behaviors or injuries that should make you think about the possibility of child abuse, they suggest the possibility, but in isolation, they don't usually prove it. There are behavioral indicators, changes in behavior, physical indicators, bruises or injuries, but it's important to use common sense in deciding and figuring out, does this really make me worry about abuse, or is there some other good explanation for what it is I'm seeing in the child? Common sense takes into fact normal development. You don't expect a 3-week-old child to be crawling over to the top of the stairs, so they couldn't possibly do that before they roll down. However, the child who is running and climbing and tumbling can get into all kinds of accidental injuries. We're all familiar with toddler bruises. Kids who are learning to walk frequently fall and bump their foreheads or get bumps and bruises on their shins. But they don't bruise their bottoms. They don't bruise their abdomens. They don't bruise their backs in those normal activities. Another common thing to recognize is that diaper rash is very common in children in diapers as well as young children who are in the process of learning toileting. And we don't want to confuse diaper rash and immediately jump to the possibility of sexual abuse because there's redness in the genital area. We have to think about those life events and normal sorts of activities that the children are involved in. The injuries that a child may get learning to ride a bike are going to be very different from the child who's learning to roll over. The child learning to roll over should have no injuries, but riding a bike could cause a number. What are some of the signs of possible physical abuse in the child? When the child has an injury that does not make sense for the child's age or development, such as the 3-week-old who supposedly crawled to the top of the stairs, the infant with bruising anywhere on the body or blood in the eye or the mouth is a huge red flag. Infants rarely get accidental bruises. Any bruising of the trunk, the ears, or the neck in a child who's less than 4 years of age is a big red flag, and patterned bruises or burns, injuries that have marks that outline or identify the object that was used to inflict the injury, are another sign of possible physical abuse. Bruises on uncommonly injured body parts, also a big red flag. We see kids getting bruises on their shins and on their foreheads, but it's rare to see accidental bruises on the abdomen, the chest, the buttocks, or the ears. A child who has multiple serious injuries at different stages of healing, especially if they're in unusual locations or totally unexplained, should again raise some level of concern. Any child who reports that they are being physically harmed or injured should be taken seriously. What about the signs of sexual abuse? Any child who reports sexual touching should be taken seriously. Any unexplained genital pain or bleeding. And unexplained means after a good medical evaluation, there is not a good explanation or medical condition that would account for the child's bleeding. The young child who demonstrates bizarre, sophisticated, or unusual sexual knowledge or behavior is a red flag. We have to think about, where did this child learn these activities? The child who asks unexpected or unusual questions related to sexual activity would fall into this category as well. We have to contemplate and decide, what have they learned, what are they seeing, versus what are they experiencing. And any child who becomes pregnant or contracts a sexually transmitted disease at less than 14 years of age is a sign of sexual abuse. What about the parents? When the parent offers a conflicting and unconvincing or no explanation at all for a child's serious injury, that raises the concern. If the parent shows little concern for the child, sees the child as entirely bad or evil, if the parent demands a level of performance that the child cannot attain, often child abuse occurs in the context of a child crying too much or a child who wets their pants. Parents expecting them to not wet their pants, but in fact, that's obviously going to happen. The parent who denies the existence of or blames the child for problems in home or at school. the parent who uses harsh physical discipline, all red flags. And when there's domestic violence, drug or alcohol abuse in the home, or mental illness in the home, the risks are higher to those children for possible maltreatment. The key issues in identifying and recognizing physical abuse is a story about what happened that doesn't make sense for the type of injury that the child has, or the story may not make sense with the type of abilities that the child would have. The child that has no history for a significant injury or multiple injuries of different ages. And again, any infant with an injury, a bruise, a burn, a fracture, a mouth injury, should be extremely alarming and should warrant additional evaluation for possible child abuse or neglect. Any bruise in an infant is a huge red flag. Here we have an infant with a black eye, another infant with bruising and injury inside the mouth, and a third infant with just this little red mark over the eye. But that little infant with the red mark over the eye, when evaluated, had 17 fractures. And he was evaluated only because he had that bruise above his eye that was recognized as something that shouldn't be there. A slap mark or bruising in and around the ear in a child of any age is very worrisome for an inflicted injury. Obviously, the slap mark is an inflicted injury, but bruising in and about the ear is often the result of jerking or yanking on the ear. This is a dip burn, and when children get burns that suggest a pattern that they have been immersed in hot water, that should immediately raise the red flag for possible maltreatment. You don't bruise until you cruise. It is extremely rare for children who are not yet able to walk along furniture or pull themselves to stand to get themselves into a position where they might get a bruise. Even young infants who have siblings who may sometimes get a little rough with them will rarely, if ever, have a bruise. The literature documents that fewer than 1% of children less than 6 months of age will have a bruise. All citizens in Indiana have a legal obligation to report concerns of possible child abuse or neglect, even if someone else disagrees with them. We as citizens cannot investigate or handle the problem alone. It requires a joint effort. And it's not our jobs in general to do that legal investigation. The reporter's identifying information is kept confidential unless it is necessary in court. When should you report? You report to Child Protection Services when you have a reason to believe that child abuse or neglect may have occurred. That reason can be based on what you see, what you hear, or what you have been told. It's a misdemeanor not to report if there is a reasonable suspicion of child abuse or neglect, and there is immunity from civil or criminal liability for a good faith report, a report you made because you were honestly concerned about the child. To make a report, you call the Indiana Child Protection Services hotline at
All right, so listen, that's a very heavy video throwing a lot of information at you. I get it. I want to go over just a few things. I hope in the context of our work at the church, we're not going to see, like that dip burn one was really tough to watch. But let me ask you, in the context of a church, you know, a child ministry, or we see somebody, what would be some indications that physical abuse might be taking place, that we got a suspicion? Just fielding that. Maybe you're a Sunday school teacher. What? Their affect, yeah.
If they flinch when they're approached, if they
Yeah.
constantly have a pattern of looking like they're afraid.
Yeah, definitely. Now again, there are some kids that, you know, are accident prone, but if they seem to have a broken bone every time you see them, there's a big question mark with that. Obviously, if they've got slap marks or big bruises or coming with a black eye, that's, you know, a clear sign. What about sexual abuse? What would be some signs if you were a Sunday school teacher, or maybe you're, I don't know, after service and some kids, you're talking to them or what have you? What would be some signs that maybe sexual abuse is going on? Sexualized content. I actually worked as a volunteer at a camp in New Jersey. It was a really tough one. I was a volunteer chaplain, me and my wife, and we had a case where there was a young person, about 12 years old, that snuck a device in, and then not only proceeded that whole cabin, which there was an adult there, sharing all of that content, was then drawing pictures and telling stories about some boy that she had a crush on, and all the things, describing in very graphic detail all the things that she wanted to do with this. Well, it's like, where in the world and again, it's that unusual knowledge or imagination around this can be a sign of that. And so just kind of being aware if it gets into a very weird topic, or if you are in a Sunday school classroom and, pictures, a lot of times younger kids will depict on paper, drawing with crayons what may be happening in the home, and just being aware of that. What about emotional abuse? That's a very big topic.
Do you have a negative self-image, a pattern of that?
Yeah.
Self-criticism and criticize others.
Yeah, absolutely. What about this, talking about being someone that stands in the gap to be a welcome? What if you see, I don't know, what if you see a parent melt down on a kid out in the narthex? Is a public meltdown on a 6-year-old in public at church, and when I say meltdown, I mean real meltdown. Does that qualify as emotional abuse? It's not appropriate. The adult ought to be emotionally regulated enough to know that if there is a behavior issue with a 6-year-old in church, maybe we'll talk about this when we get home, or, please stop that, not just the complete and utter meltdown that you might see. That's a sign of that. The withdrawal that you can often see with kids that go. And other thing, too, is that sometimes what you'll see is that there is a general, if not terror, there is a sense of not wanting to be around whoever the primary caretaker is or who the source of the emotional abuse is. There's a reticence. That's a sign of emotional abuse. Yeah. And so my question is what is our duty if we see at least patterns of it? Now, I want to make a distinction in this, but what if you suspect one of these things, sexual, physical, emotional abuse? But again, it's a suspicion at this point. What do you think our duty is as officers of the church? We are mandatory reporters, but let's say it's a borderline thing, like maybe the kid's a little, withdrawn, there's some things going on, and you're just, in your mind, you're like, something's going on here, but I'm not quite sure. We'll get into the mandatory part here in a second. What do you think our duty ought to be? Yeah. If there are enough red flags where you're having this suspicion, but you're not even sure yourself, a good place to start would be to pull the staff in, me, Dave, Lily, and say, I've seen, and if you see, like, say a child depicts some sort of violent or sexual act or some terrible thing, on paper, grab that paper, have it with you, and start a conversation, and then say, I have some real problems here, and we will discern together, maybe we do need to call CPS. And I've had 2 cases even in my time here where I've had to talk with CPS. All right? And it's not conversations that I long to have, but, we will take that step. If that. Now, what if you see the public meltdown or the constant bruising or the broken arms or, some of the other red flags, or in the middle of the meltdown or what have you? What do you think our duty is?
Speak up, step in a gracious but firm way.
Yeah, absolutely. So stop immediately what's going on there, and then the mandatory reporting part. And this is a hard one for officers of the church because we don't want to be the person to have to make the call. But if you see explicit behaviors, things that just, there's not a question in your mind that this is not appropriate, we have a duty to report that directly to authorities. All right? And this is the distinction. This is a hard one. And here I want to be very clear. When we're talking about explicit behaviors or patterns that we're seeing in the child, we have a duty, and it's I know that this is difficult, but at the end of the day, in the same way we were talking about harassment, without a community or people willing to stand in the breach and step into that gap, the victim will continue to be victimized, and there are no boundary markers for the abuser. And trust me, in what I've read and the few cases I've seen, behaviors always tend to escalate until someone puts the brakes on them. All right? Let me see. I don't know what videos we have here. I had some scenarios. So we do have a set. I want to invite you to do two things. We do have in our child protection policies in the church and the manual of operations, they have a set of guidelines. We are all volunteers, especially with children and youth, are mandatory reporters if you're working in that context. They mentioned your gut. Don't, if your gut's telling you something, trust your gut. All right? So keep that in mind. Please review those policies. And the second thing I want to point out to you is here's another big indicator when it comes to child protection. We have, and we adopted from the Scouts, we have what we call a 2-deep policy. And here's the 2-deep policy. Anyone under the age of 19 or 18 will never be alone with, communicate electronically or otherwise with an adult by themselves. Even in a text message, there ought to be no adult-child texting, anything of that nature, phone calls, electronic communication. It's very easy on an email to CC somebody, right? So again, I don't mean to pick on you, Dave, but let's say Tom had to be out of town for acolytes, and he's like, Dave, can you help me with acolytes? And we need 2 fifth graders to help us do acolytes. If Dave is going to reach out to the 2 potential candidates, what's the easy thing that Dave can do in the email? He may have the email for the 2 kids, and Dave can CC me, Lily, and the parents, and suddenly we've got plenty of adults that see what that conversation is, and there's never any one-on-ones. Yes? That you can do that. You can do that as well. I'm just saying that the world is changing. Kids got cell phones and stuff like this. I'm just saying it is the nature of the world. You'll have 4th or 5th graders with text. Even if you're texting with a minor, you have other adults on that text thread. And it is the job of the other adults to make sure that, that everything is by the book. And if you see something, you need to speak up about that. The other thing, too, is, this is a big red flag in churches. This is where predators, if they come into an institution or a situation, they love where they don't have those boundary things. And you'll see things like, this adult's like, I'll just give these kids a ride home. If you see it, any single adult giving a minor a ride home, and it's just them in their car, your red flag ought to just go up, wave real high, because, you can see, I know in the scouting things, the training that they do, do you know how many sexual abuse, assault encounters happened in cars, rides home to minors from just having a single adult? Oh my gosh, it's like this prime area for it. So again, we have it 2 deep, always 2 adults in those interactions, whether it's interacting personally, email, text. If you see otherwise, you need to speak up and let somebody know about it. Yes?
I was just going to say, telephone
Yes.
So in my particular case, if the scout calls me, I will say, hang on, and of course I get Ralphie because Ralphie's there. I said, hang on, I'll put it on speakerphone, and then Ralphie will say hi, and then you have that 2D leadership, you know, or any other person that you know that's, hey, listen, will you listen to this conversation with me? Because that's where you can really get caught.
Yes, absolutely. And again, it's so easy with our phones now, speakerphone. Yeah, it's an excellent, excellent point just to have somebody else present in the conversation. And again, we're not trying to get into a siege lockdown mentality here, but again, you know, it's been such, I mean, it's almost exhaustive, the number of cases and the patterns that abusers, especially around sexual abuse, use. And it's any opportunity to isolate and get alone a child, grooming behavior, normalizing those interactions. You know, it's not like your typical abuser's going to see a kid and be like, hey, I'm going to take this kid home, and then everything happens. It's a process. They normalize the alone interactions to where the child who doesn't have the equipment to know, they normalize that pattern of behavior. Even the parents get normalized to that pattern of behavior so that they don't suspect anything. And after the 10th or the 12th or the 15th interaction, it starts moving into these other areas. All right? So if we're vigilant around too deep policy on any form of communication and interaction, and if we are vigilant about, you know, being aware of some of the red flags that were mentioned in this video, and not all of them are going to be like dip burn things, all right? You know, some of them are going to be subtle. At a minimum, if you have a suspicion, we need to start a conversation. If we will be vigilant about those things, we can at least create an environment that makes it more difficult for a potential abuser to operate, okay? Now, and it's just so much information I've thrown at you. We are 15 minutes over. I want to open up for any conversation or last-minute questions before we dismiss with prayer. And again, apologies. I mean, it goes with staff too. You know, there's no staff member here that's immune. There ought to be no interactions with minors, you know, and so it can be that conversation. If there's a staff member that's meeting with minors without another adult present, right, that, you know, one, that's a violation of 2D policy. As elders especially, but even as deacons, you know, you can come to me or Dave or what have you, and you can ask, well, what do you think? And be like, well, clearly against the 2D policy, and we can have a conversation, and, you know, maybe nothing happened, but we can definitely, you know, you've been warned, no more single interactions with minors or what have you. If we see it again, then we're going to have, you know, a major HR problem. Not everything's going to be, you know, has to end in some sort of dramatic, terrible, you know, court case or something of that nature. You know, even just starting the conversation can make sure that we don't devolve into worse patterns. Any other final questions or comments?
Just that I appreciate you doing the training because it can really promote safety at church. Not just physical safety, but psychological safety. So protection, you know, and spiritual safety. So it's creating a safe cultural environment that's welcoming. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, yeah.
And that we don't accommodate or enable abusive behavior. And it's a way to love well the person that might be at risk of being a perpetrator too, and it protects people that could be vulnerable. So I just appreciate it.
Yeah.
Not all churches have done this kind of training, so it's great.
Yeah. Anyone else? You've been patient, you've been kind, and you've even endured YouTube commercials. So, one weakness in YouTube. Is there anyone